In the summer of 1588, as the Armada loomed across the Channel, a young Charles Blount served aboard the Rainbow as a volunteer under Lord Henry Seymour. The 8th Baron Mountjoy would come to that title later after his brother's death in 1594, but already he was tall, handsome, and steady, a man whose family had served the Tudors for 4 generations. He would become Lord Deputy of Ireland, presiding over the last and bloodiest years of Elizabeth's reign, and die just 3 years into the rule of James I. His story was not simply war and politics. The Blounts had always been close to power, sometimes uncomfortably so. His kinsman had been Tudor to the prince who became Henry VIII. A more distant relative, Bessie Blount, had borne that king's only acknowledged illegitimate son. And Charles's own doomed love affair with Penelope Rich would scandalize the Elizabethan court. To understand how Charles Blount found himself serving against the Armada, representing a lineage that was part of every chapter of Tudor history, we have to first go back to the roots of the Mountjoy family, to the castles and manors of medieval Staffordshire and Derbyshire, where ambition and service first intertwined in the name of Blount. Let's get into it. Hello, friend. Welcome back to the Renaissance English History Podcast, the original Tudor history podcast telling stories of 16th century England since 2009. I am your host, Heather, and I am delighted, as always, that you are here with me today. I'm really enjoying this thing that we started this year of kind of tracing noble families, figuring out where they came from, how they rose under the Tudors, and then what happened to them later. And I thought I would continue that. You know, it's funny because you hear about these families and you hear them mentioned in different contexts and at different times, and you don't realize that they were all together. So I've been reading about Charles Blount quite a bit recently, a couple of different things that have all come together. First, in our Tudor Top 50 yearly program this past week was on the Irish Rebellion, and so I came across him there. Also, I'm getting ready to interview Tracy Borman on her new book on James I's succession, and so I've run into him there. And I never actually even put it together that that's the same family as Bessie Blount. And I was like, hang on, this family has been hanging out at court for quite a while, and I never actually dug into them. And so I wanted to do that this week. Also, I just want to address the pronunciation because some people might wonder about that. It is spelled Blount. I've heard it pronounced both Blount and Blunt. I'm just in the habit of saying Blunt. You could say Blount too, I'm sure, and nobody will get offended. I'm saying Blunt. That's how we're going with that, okay? So let's get into it. Blount, Blunt, potato, it's all the same family. So the Blounts/Blounts were an old family. Their origins were traceable all the way back to the Norman conquest. The name itself, from the Old French le blond, meaning fair-haired, actually appears in the Domesday records across Worcestershire and Staffordshire. By the 15th century, branches of the family held manors in places like Kinlet, Knightley, and Soddington, with lines seated at Baron Mountjoy and Elveston in Derbyshire. Though not among the greatest of the great magnates, they're not Percys, they're not Nevilles, they were well born enough to fight, marry, and scheme among the powerful. The very first Blount to make a real mark was Sir Walter Blount, who fought for John of Gaunt in Spain during the 1360s. His loyalty to the Lancastrian cause earned him both land and legend. He was immortalized by Shakespeare in Henry IV Part I as the valiant Sir Walter who dies wearing the king's armor at Shrewsbury in 1403. That loyalty to the House of Lancaster became a part of the family's identity. When Gaunt's son, Henry Bolingbroke, became Henry IV, the Blounts were among those rewarded for their very early support. The family's fortunes remained tied to whichever branch of the Lancastrian tree seemed most likely to survive. Walter Blount of the next generation didn't have an easy road to travel because that's when the Wars of the Roses was happening, of course. He served as Treasurer of Calais under Edward IV after 1460. This was one of the most important financial offices in the entire kingdom. It controlled the garrison that guarded England's last continental foothold. For his loyalty and competence at the Battle of Towton, he was elevated to the peerage in 1465, the title Baron Mountjoy marking the family's transformation from local gentry to national players. In the same year, he was made Lord High Treasurer of England. Walter's descendants inherited more than the land and the title. They also inherited a habit of service to kings, to princes, and increasingly to education and learning. Those early Mountjoys became noted patrons of education and the arts, a reputation that would blossom fully in the next generation. Walter's grandson John Blount, 3rd Baron Mountjoy, continued the family's tradition at court. Like many men of the period, he spent time on the northern borders, serving in military and administrative posts. But John's son, William, the 4th Baron Mountjoy, would transform the family's image entirely. Born around 1478, William was educated in the new humanist tradition that was spreading throughout Europe. He studied in Paris, where he met Erasmus and studied under him for a year. Erasmus was entranced by his pupil, calling him most learned among. When Mountjoy invited Erasmus to England in 1499, the great scholar came, and Mountjoy arranged introductions at court and to fellow intellectuals like Thomas More and John Colet. This connection with Erasmus and the early English humanists placed the Blounts at the cutting edge of cultural change. When Henry VII's cautious new regime sought to legitimize itself through learning and refinement rather than sheer power, Mountjoy's blend of nobility and intellect made him very useful. He became a tutor and companion to Prince Henry, the future Henry VIII, introducing the boy to Erasmus, to More, and the ideals of the Renaissance, classical balance, eloquence, and the belief that kings could be both warriors and scholars. Under Henry VIII's later rule, of course, the irony of that humanist education would not be lost. The same prince who learned from men like Mountjoy would one day send Thomas More to the block. But at the dawn of the new century, when the Tudor sun seemed bright and orderly, the Blounts represented the best of what service could be: loyal, learned, and gracefully positioned near the throne. By the time William Blount died in 1534, he had watched the world that he had helped shape begin to shift uneasily beneath his feet. A more distant relation of the family, Elizabeth Bessie Blount, had become the king's mistress, and through her the Blount name took a far more intimate turn with the crown. So Elizabeth Blount, Bessie to history, was born around 1498 in Shropshire, the daughter of Sir John Blount of Kinlet and Catherine Peschel. Her family's branch connected her to the Mountjoy line through the wider Blount kinship network, but she came from a younger branch. Still, she was connected enough to move easily at court. Her upbringing was cultured and well-mannered, the kind that prepared girls for royal service. In her teens, she joined the household of Catherine of Aragon, where she served as one of the Queen's maids of honor. The royal household in the 1510s was alive with music and dancing and youthful flirtation. Henry VIII was still the athletic young prince that Erasmus had once admired, tall, golden, and endlessly drawn to pretty women who could sing and ride and laugh at his jokes. Bessie, by every surviving account, was exactly that sort of woman. The Venetian ambassador described her as a very beautiful damsel and in great favor with the king. Their affair likely began around 1514, still a teenager. It was discreet by royal standards, meaning everyone at court knew, but it was treated as one of those passing amusements of a young king. The difference came on June 15th, 1519, when Bessie gave birth to a son. The boy was named Henry FitzRoy, literally son of the king. For the first and only time, Henry VIII publicly acknowledged an illegitimate child. He granted Bessie generous lands and pensions, but her real reward came in her son's elevation. In 1525, FitzRoy was made Duke of Richmond and Somerset, a move that astonished Europe. The last man to hold those titles had been Henry's own uncle, and to revive them for an illegitimate child signaled just how seriously the king was regarding him. At the time, Queen Catherine's hopes for another child were fading, and Henry's acknowledgement of FitzRoy hinted at something quite dangerous. The idea that maybe if the Pope would not grant a divorce, the king might one day legitimize his son and make him his heir. Whether Bessie herself ever entertained that fantasy is impossible to know, but the creation of a ducal household for her son placed her family right at the heart of the Tudor world. Bessie's own story after the affair reads like a quiet retreat from scandal. By 1522, she had married Gilbert Talbot of Lincolnshire, a rising courtier who was made Baron Talbot of Kyme shortly after their union, likely a reward arranged by the king for marrying his former mistress and providing a stable household for her. Together, they had several children, and by all accounts, it was actually a very happy match. Gilbert died in 1530, and Bessie later remarried Edward Clinton, who would become the Earl of Lincoln and Lord High Admiral. Through that marriage, she remained within the web of court families whose loyalty sustained the Tudors. Her son Henry's life was, though, very short. He grew up at court, he received the education of a prince, he even married Mary Howard, the Duke of Norfolk's daughter. But in July 1536, just a few weeks after Anne Boleyn was executed, only 17 years old, he died suddenly, likely of tuberculosis. His death removed one of the few alternatives to the succession crisis that was consuming Henry's reign. It also extinguished the most visible male offspring bearing any trace of a Blount connection to the crown. Still, the impact of Bessie's affair lingered. She had proven fertile where Catherine of Aragon had not, and that fact gnawed at Henry's pride. It became one of the earliest rationalizations for his annulment. If he could father healthy sons with other women, the problem could not be his, of course. That's what he thought. In that sense, Bessie's child did alter the trajectory of the English Reformation. Bessie herself lived until around 1539 or 1540, long enough to see Anne Boleyn rise and fall and to watch the monarchy remake itself around the king's whims. Her descendants through the Talbot and Clinton families continued to serve at court, but her own story faded into the background, a curiosity of an earlier, perhaps more romantic age. But through her, the Blounts had touched the crown directly, not through politics or war, but through intimacy. The next generation, led by William Blount, the fourth Baron Mountjoy, returned to a more respectable form of influence, books, learning, and humanist ideals that would shape a very different England. While Bessie became famous for capturing the king's attention, the other branch, led by William Blount, fourth Baron Mountjoy, led a more respectable form of influence with books, learning, and humanist ideals that would shape a very different England. So we hinted at him before, but we'll dig into him now. William was born around 1478. He belonged to the senior branch of the family, the one that had risen through service under the Yorkist and Lancastrian and adapted neatly to the new Tudor order. William grew up amid the cautious optimism of the early Tudor peace. Educated first in England and then Paris, he absorbed the principles of Renaissance humanism at their source. It was a time when the sons of noble families were beginning to see education not as a clerical necessity, but as a gentleman's ornament. Mountjoy was quick-minded and fluent in Latin and became a patron and student of Erasmus. In Paris in 1498, the young Mountjoy met Erasmus and studied under him for a year, and then in 1499 he persuaded Erasmus to come to England. He arranged his lodgings, introduced him to his circle of intellectuals, including Thomas More and John Colet, and helped to secure royal attention for the visiting scholar. The two men became close friends, and Erasmus later recalled how Mountjoy was born with an angelic disposition toward all good learning. This connection gave the Blount family an unusual prestige at court, a reputation for intellect as much as ancestry. When the young Prince Henry needed tutors and companions, Mountjoy was a natural choice. He served in that capacity part of the small humanist circle that helped to shape the future king's tastes in music and theology and the classics. In Henry's early years as king, Mountjoy was a fixture at court festivities, known for his wit and refinement and his ability to move easily between courtiers and scholars. As the reign progressed, Mountjoy's career took on more official duties. He was appointed Master of the Mint in 1509, an important financial post that gave him influence in the king's economic policy. He also served in the royal household and accompanied Henry to the Field of Cloth of Gold meeting with Francis I in 1520. Of course, this is the dazzling spectacle of Renaissance kingship that symbolized everything Mountjoy had believed England could become: cultured, wealthy, and magnificent. But the court was changing. By the 1520s, the energy that had once gone into scholarship was being redirected into the storm of Henry's great matter. Mountjoy watched as the king that he had once tutored turned the tools of humanism, debate, logic, and scripture into weapons against his own church. It was an age when clever men could lose their heads for words once spoken in confidence. Mountjoy himself managed to stay clear of factional traps, likely helped by his cautious temperament and his willingness to serve without intrigue. He was the chamberlain to Catherine of Aragon from 1512, and then in 1530 he reluctantly signed a letter urging the Pope to grant the divorce. In 1533, he was forced to announce to Catherine the king's new marriage. He actually begged Thomas Cromwell to not be the one to do this. He asked for relief from this duty. He also remained a patron of learning till the end. His home became a gathering place for translators, poets, and students, including Juan Luis Vives, the Spanish humanist who tutored Princess Mary. Through Mountjoy's network, ideas flowed from Antwerp and Louvain into the English court. Ideas about education for women, the moral duties of rulers, and the need for faith guided by reason. Mountjoy died in November 1534, just as England was breaking from Rome. He left behind a modest fortune, a respected name, and a family firmly embedded in the Tudor elite. His own legacy was intellectual, the blending of learning and loyalty that had once defined the best of Henry's early reign. In a sense, the Mountjoys mirrored the evolution of England itself, from medieval service to Renaissance confidence, and now toward the uneasy modernity of the Reformation. By the next generation, the family's fortunes would turn martial again. Hey, quick thank you to my Patreon supporters who make this show possible. If you want monthly tutor courses, mini courses, live chats with historians, early access, ad-free to episodes, and to join our community, I've just restructured the tiers with 3 simple options starting at $5 a month. Check it out, patreon.com/EnglandCast. That's patreon.com/EnglandCast. When Elizabeth came to the throne, Charles Blount, the 8th Baron Mountjoy, would emerge not as a patron of learning, but as one of the Queen's most devoted soldiers and administrators. By the time Charles Blount inherited the title of Lord Mountjoy in 1594, the family name had been synonymous with loyal service for over a century. But Charles was no dusty courtier living on ancestral credit. He was young, eloquent, and handsome, the kind of man that Elizabeth I had noticed. Born in 1563, the son of James Blount, 6th Baron Mountjoy, Charles was educated at Oxford and studied law at one of the Inns of Court. He arrived at court around 1583, just as Elizabeth's later generation of favorites, men like the Earl of Essex and Sir Walter Raleigh, were rising. He quickly made an impression. Elizabeth once teasingly nicknamed him her young Mountjoy, and when the Spanish Armada threatened in 1588, he served aboard the Rainbow as a volunteer. That service cemented his place in her circle, but Mountjoy's real distinction came from his intellect and his independence. He wasn't a flatterer by nature, and Elizabeth, who often preferred the dangerous charm of men like Essex, found him intriguing because he seemed both loyal and slightly apart. Through Essex, Mountjoy gained military experience in the Netherlands and Brittany, fighting in the wars that pitted Protestant England against the Spanish Catholic power. He earned a reputation for courage and composure, though Essex's brash leadership sometimes grated on him. Their friendship was genuine, but their temperaments were opposite. Essex was impulsive and theatrical, and Mountjoy was thoughtful and restrained. Then came Penelope Rich, Essex's sister. Married unhappily to Lord Rich, she and Mountjoy fell deeply in love by the early 1590s, one of those tangled Elizabethan affairs that everyone gossiped about and no one could quite condemn because both were too admired to scorn outright. Their relationship lasted for years, and they had 5 children together. Though Elizabeth was furious when she discovered it, Mountjoy's standing was too valuable for her to dismiss him completely. In 1599, when Essex disastrously bungled his command in Ireland and returned to England without permission, it was Mountjoy whom Elizabeth chose to replace him as Lord Deputy of Ireland. It was a perilous honor. The 9 Years' War was draining England's treasury and morale, and the Irish leader, Hugh O'Neill, Earl of Tyrone, was proving far more capable than any English commander had expected. And those of you who are in the Tudor Top 50 year-long program will remember us talking about this. We just talked about it this week. So Mountjoy approached the task differently from his predecessors. He combined ruthless military campaigns with careful diplomacy, understanding that victory would come as much through exhaustion as conquest. His campaigns in Ulster were devastating, scorched earth tactics that left famine in their wake, but they broke Tyrone's hold on the countryside. In 1601, he faced his greatest test at the Siege of Kinsale when Spanish forces landed in support of the Irish. Mountjoy's army, worn down and half-starved, managed to defeat them, effectively ending the rebellion. This victory made him indispensable. Elizabeth's death in 1603 found him still in Ireland, securing the new regime's control on behalf of James VI of Scotland, now the First of England. He managed the transition between monarchs with skill, ensuring that the garrisons swore loyalty to James and preventing unrest at a critical moment. In return, the new king created him Earl of Devonshire. But triumph did not bring peace. In 1605, after Lord Rich divorced Penelope, she and Mountjoy married in a private ceremony conducted by William Laud, later the Archbishop of Canterbury, on December 26th. The marriage was carried out in defiance of canon law. The church had granted the divorce but forbidden remarriage. King James was outraged. Both were banished from court, and their children remained legally illegitimate. Charles died on April 3, 1606. He was only 43, but he was exhausted from years of war and politics. Penelope outlived him only by 15 months, dying in July of 1607. Together, they were remembered as one of the tragic romances of Elizabeth's reign, a pair of brilliant, doomed lovers caught between personal loyalty and royal duty. Mountjoy's career closed the Tudor century in miniature: service, brilliance, scandal, and a restless hunger for honor that never quite found satisfaction. The line itself would fade soon after his death, leaving behind estates but no legitimate heirs, and a name that, for a brief moment, had shone brightly in the Queen's favor. The story of the Blounts is a thread that stretches through the entire Tudor century. From Sir Walter's loyalty at Shrewsbury to Bessie's royal son and Charles's campaigns in Ireland, the family was never that far from the action, sometimes basking in favor, sometimes brushing against ruin. After Charles Blount's death in 1606, his illegitimate son, Mountjoy Blount, eventually received favor from James I. The family title was revived for him in 1618 as Baron Mountjoy, and in 1628 he was created the Earl of Newport. But without legitimate heirs from Charles, the direct senior line had ended. By the mid-17th century, the estates were dispersed. But the Blounts left behind a rare legacy, one that spanned every kind of Tudor ambition. They were soldiers, scholars, lovers, and courtiers. William Blount, the humanist, brought Erasmus to England. Bessie Blount proved the Tudor bloodline could produce sons, and Charles Blount ended the last great rebellion of Elizabeth's reign. Few families managed to stay so continuously relevant from the first Henry Tudor to the first Stuart. Their story also mirrors the changing nature of service itself. In the 15th century, the Blounts earned power by wielding swords for kings. By the 16th, they served through intellect and culture. And by Elizabeth's time, survival depended on political skill. Today, the Blounts of Mountjoy are little remembered beyond monuments and occasional footnotes. But if you look closely at the Tudor century, they were always there. They were advising, they were fighting, they were bringing humanists to England. They were just always there. So I think it was worth us talking about them, obviously. So we will leave it there, my friend. I hope you enjoyed that. I hope you learned something. If you did, of course, you can always leave me a comment wherever you are listening to this. I'd love to read those comments. And also, if you press that like button, wherever you're listening to this as well, that definitely helps to get the word out about our content. And if you're not already subscribed, why don't you go ahead and hit subscribe too, so you never miss any of the podcasts and episodes that I put out. Also, the Tudor Learning Circle is a social network just for Tudor history nerds, tudorlearningscircle.com, all of the fun of social media without any of the drama of social media. Just Tudor history, tudorlearningscircle.com, and I do hang out in there and would love to see you in there. And don't forget about the Patreon, patreon.com/EnglandCast to get more content, our hangouts, all kinds of fun stuff. All right, my friend, I will leave it there for now. Thank you so much for your time. Thank you for spending this time with me, for listening, and for just sharing in our mutual love of Tudor history. I will be back with a full episode next week. I will be on the YouTubes before then. I will see you all over the Tudor webs. All right, my friend. Thanks for listening. Have an amazing week. Bye-bye.
Blow, northern wind, ascend who may be sweating. Blow, northern wind, blow, blow, blow. Ich hatte Bord in Bauerbricht, dat soll is semlis on Sicht. Mensch, cool Maiden of me.